3 months had passed since Jesus revealed the hidden requirement for the rapture bridal readiness and the devastating test that determined whether believers were truly prepared for his return. That revelation had shattered my comfortable assumptions about end times and forced me to confront the reality that millions of sincere Christians who expected to be raptured might not actually be ready for that encounter. But what haunted me most wasn't what Jesus had revealed, it was what he hadn't said. During our final conversation in the California desert, when he spoke about the test of bridal readiness, I had sensed there was something more, something deeper that he was holding back. The way his expression had grown more solemn, the pause before his final words, the weight in his voice when he said, "Tell them transformation is possible." It all suggested there was another layer to this revelation that I wasn't yet ready to receive. The answer came during what should have been a moment of celebration. The Chosen had just been renewed for its final seasons, and I was receiving messages from believers worldwide who were experiencing spiritual transformation through our portrayal of Christ. Yet beneath the external blessing, I was wrestling with a growing burden about the state of the church and the approaching end times. The trigger came during a private conversation with a prominent prophecy teacher after a conference in Phoenix. Dr. Marcus Webb had spent 40 years studying eschatology and was considered one of the foremost experts on the rapture. His books had sold millions of copies, and his conferences drew thousands of believers eager to understand the timing of Christ's return. "Jonathan," he said as we sat in his hotel suite overlooking the desert, "I've been watching your recent interviews about end times, and I'm concerned about some of the things you've been suggesting. This idea that there might be requirements for the rapture beyond simple faith, it's dangerous territory. We need to be careful not to undermine the security believers have in their salvation." I had been sharing carefully selected insights from my encounters with Jesus, always being cautious not to claim direct revelation, but simply raising questions about whether the modern church truly understood what it meant to be ready for Christ's return. "Dr." Webb's response was typical of the reaction I'd been receiving from established prophecy teachers. "But Dr. Webb," I replied, "what if we've become so focused on the security of our salvation that we've forgotten the necessity of transformation? What if there are believers who are genuinely saved but not actually ready to stand in Christ's presence?" His expression grew stern. "Jonathan, that's works-based theology. The rapture is based on grace alone, faith alone. Every believer will be taken up regardless of their spiritual condition because it's not about our readiness, it's about Christ's finished work." As he spoke with absolute certainty about the unconditional nature of the rapture, I felt that familiar stirring in my spirit that had preceded my previous encounters with Jesus. Something about Dr. Webb's confidence, his dismissal of any possibility that believers might not be ready, struck me as dangerously presumptuous. That night, alone in my Phoenix hotel room, I found myself on my knees in desperate prayer. "Lord," I whispered, "Dr. Webb represents the thinking of millions of believers who are absolutely certain about the rapture. But I sense there's something we're still missing, something that could mean the difference between salvation and damnation for countless souls. What is the final barrier that's keeping people from understanding what it really means to be ready for your return?" What happened next was unlike my previous encounters with Jesus. Instead of his immediate presence filling the room, I felt drawn to leave the hotel and drive into the Arizona desert. It was past midnight, but something compelled me to find a place of complete solitude where heaven could speak without the interference of human noise and distraction. I drove for an hour into the Sonoran Desert until I found a remote area where the city lights were just a distant glow on the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, painted silver by a full moon, utterly silent except for the distant call of a coyote and the whisper of wind through saguaro cacti. As I stood alone under the vast Arizona sky, surrounded by the profound silence that only wilderness can provide, I felt it that deepening of reality that preceded divine encounter. The desert around me seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the moon above. And then Jesus was walking toward me across the sand, his presence both utterly natural and completely overwhelming. "Jonathan," he said, his voice carrying across the desert silence with absolute authority, "you've sensed correctly that there's something more, something that even the revelation about bridal readiness doesn't fully address. Tonight, I'm going to show you the final barrier that's keeping millions of believers from understanding what it really means to be ready for the rapture." As he approached, I could see that his expression was more serious than I had ever witnessed before. This wasn't just about theological correction or spiritual instruction, this was about something that could determine the eternal destiny of countless souls. The final barrier, Jesus continued, is not theological ignorance or spiritual immaturity. It's not even the lack of bridal readiness, though that's certainly part of it. The final barrier is something so fundamental, so deeply embedded in modern Christianity that most believers don't even recognize it as a barrier at all. Before I could ask what he meant, the desert around us dissolved. We were observing what appeared to be a vast panorama of contemporary Christianity, not just individual believers, but entire denominations, theological systems, and spiritual movements that claim to be preparing people for Christ's return. Look carefully, Jesus instructed. What do you see? I watched as millions of sincere believers engaged in what they believed was preparation for the rapture. They studied prophecy charts, attended end times conferences, debated theological positions, and lived moral lives while confidently expecting to be taken up when Christ returned. Their faith appeared genuine, their devotion sincere, their biblical knowledge extensive. But as I looked deeper, guided by Jesus' perspective, I began to see something that chilled me to the bone. Despite their sincere religious activity, despite their correct theology about the rapture, despite their moral behavior and prophetic knowledge, there was something missing, something so fundamental that its absence would make their expectation of being raptured a tragic delusion. What you're seeing, Jesus explained, is the final barrier that's keeping millions of believers from true readiness for my return. They've learned to believe in the rapture without understanding what the rapture actually is. They've mastered the theology of end times without experiencing the transformation that end times theology is meant to produce. The vision expanded, and I could see how this barrier manifested across different segments of Christianity. Some had become so focused on the timing of the rapture that they'd forgotten its purpose. Others had become so confident in their theological position that they'd stopped examining their spiritual condition. Still others had become so comfortable with the idea of being rescued from tribulation that they'd never considered whether they were actually ready for translation into Christ's presence. The final barrier, Jesus said, his voice filled with both love and warning, is the substitution of intellectual agreement for spiritual reality. Millions of believers have learned to believe the right things about the rapture while remaining strangers to the spiritual transformation that would make them ready for that event. But what does that mean practically? I asked, my heart racing as I began to understand the implications of what he was revealing. It means, Jesus replied, that the modern church has created a system where people can have correct theology about the end times while living by their unregenerate nature. They can believe in the rapture while remaining spiritually unprepared for the rapture. They can expect to be taken up while lacking the spiritual reality that would make standing in my presence possible. The vision shifted to show me the difference between believers who had correct theology about the rapture and those who had experienced the spiritual reality that theology was meant to describe. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Those who had moved beyond intellectual agreement to spiritual reality didn't just believe in the rapture, they were being prepared for it through ongoing transformation. Their end times theology wasn't just information they possessed, it was reality they were experiencing as Christ prepared them for union with himself. But those who had substituted intellectual agreement for spiritual reality showed a different pattern. They could articulate complex prophetic timelines while remaining spiritually immature. They could debate rapture theology while lacking the character transformation that would make them ready for Christ's presence. They could expect to be taken up while living by the same old nature that would make standing before absolute holiness impossible. This substitution of intellectual agreement for spiritual reality, Jesus explained, is the most dangerous deception in modern Christianity because it allows people to feel secure about their eternal destiny while remaining unprepared for eternal encounter. They believe they're ready for the rapture because they believe in the rapture, not realizing that belief about an event is not the same as readiness for that event. As the vision continued, I could see how this final barrier operated across different aspects of Christian life. Believers had learned to substitute theological knowledge for spiritual experience, doctrinal correctness for character transformation, and intellectual assent for heart reality. They had mastered the art of believing the right things while remaining unchanged by those beliefs. The tragedy, Jesus continued, is that this final barrier is often strongest among those who consider themselves most prepared for my return. The more confident they become in their theological position, the less likely they are to examine their spiritual condition. The more they focus on defending their beliefs about the rapture, the less attention they pay to whether they're actually ready for the rapture. The implications of what Jesus was revealing began to overwhelm me. If the final barrier was the substitution of intellectual agreement for spiritual reality, then millions of believers who were absolutely certain about their readiness for the rapture might be tragically deceived about their actual spiritual condition. How many? I whispered, afraid to hear the answer. Jesus' expression grew infinitely sad. More than you can imagine, Jonathan. The modern church has become expert at producing people who believe the right things, while remaining spiritually unchanged by those beliefs. They've learned to fill their minds with correct theology, while their hearts remain untransformed by divine reality. As the vision began to shift, I could see that Jesus was preparing to show me something even more specific about how this final barrier operated and what it would take to remove it before it was too late. Tomorrow night, he said, meet me at the place where you first understood the difference between believing about me and actually knowing me. There I will show you exactly how this final barrier operates in the lives of sincere believers and what it takes to move from intellectual agreement to spiritual reality before my return. As his presence began to fade, his final words burned themselves into my consciousness. Tell them that believing in the rapture is not the same as being ready for the rapture. Tell them that correct theology about end times is not the same as spiritual preparation for end times. Tell them that the final barrier keeping millions from true readiness is the substitution of intellectual agreement for spiritual reality. And tell them that removing this barrier is not about learning more, it's about being transformed by what they already know. And then I was alone in the Arizona desert, the silence broken only by the distant sound of wind through cacti and the settling of cooling sand. But everything had changed. The comfortable assumption that believing in the rapture was the same as being ready for the rapture lay in ruins around me. The final barrier wasn't about theological ignorance, it was about the substitution of intellectual agreement for spiritual reality, and according to Jesus, millions of sincere believers who were confident in their readiness for his return were actually trapped behind this barrier, believing the right things while remaining spiritually unprepared for the event they expected to experience. The question that would haunt me for the next 24 hours was simple but terrifying. Had I substituted intellectual agreement for spiritual reality in my own life? And if so, what would it take to remove this final barrier before it was too late? Sleep was impossible after what Jesus had revealed about the final barrier keeping believers from true readiness for the rapture. I spent the night in my Phoenix hotel room, pacing and praying, wrestling with the devastating realization that millions of sincere Christians had substituted intellectual agreement for spiritual reality, believing the right things about end times while remaining spiritually unprepared for the events they expected to experience. What tormented me most was the recognition that this barrier might exist in my own life. Despite years of studying Scripture, despite portraying Christ on screen, despite all my theological knowledge about the rapture, I couldn't honestly say I had moved beyond intellectual agreement to the kind of spiritual reality Jesus was describing. I knew the right answers, but had those answers transformed me at the deepest level? The next evening, I drove to a small prayer garden behind an old mission church in Sedona, where I had once experienced a profound encounter with God's presence. It was a simple space surrounded by red rock formations, with weathered wooden benches facing a rustic cross. I had come here years earlier during a crisis of faith, desperate to know whether my beliefs were just intellectual constructs or genuine spiritual reality. As I settled onto the same bench where that encounter had occurred, I felt the familiar thickening of the atmosphere that preceded Jesus' appearances. The garden grew luminous with an inner light that had nothing to do with the desert sunset painting the red rocks in brilliant hues. And then Jesus was sitting beside me, his presence both comforting and overwhelming. "This is where you first tasted the difference between believing about me and actually knowing me," he said, his voice echoing softly among the red rocks. "Tonight, I'm going to show you exactly how the final barrier operates in the lives of sincere believers, and why intellectual agreement has become the greatest enemy of spiritual reality in the modern church." Before I could respond, the prayer garden around us dissolved. We were observing what appeared to be an intimate view of how the human mind and heart processed spiritual truth, not just the surface level of what people believed, but the deep reality of how those beliefs did or didn't transform their actual spiritual condition. The final barrier, Jesus explained, operates through what I call theological satisfaction, the false sense of spiritual security that comes from having correct beliefs rather than from experiencing spiritual transformation. People become satisfied with knowing the right answers instead of being changed by those answers. What I witnessed next was both subtle and devastating. Jesus showed me how sincere believers could master complex theological concepts about the rapture while remaining completely unchanged by the spiritual realities those concepts were meant to describe. The first manifestation of this barrier, Jesus said, is substituting prophetic knowledge for spiritual preparation. People study end times charts and timelines while neglecting the character transformation that would make them ready for the events they're studying. I watched as this substitution played out in the lives of different believers. Some had become experts in prophetic chronology, able to debate pre-trib versus post-trib rapture theology with sophisticated arguments, while their daily lives showed no evidence of the spiritual urgency or character development that such knowledge should produce. Others had memorized extensive scripture passages about the end times and could articulate complex theological positions about the rapture, but their hearts remained unchanged by the reality of Christ's imminent return. They had filled their minds with prophetic information, while their spirits remained untouched by prophetic transformation. This substitution of knowledge for preparation, Jesus explained, is particularly dangerous because it creates the illusion of readiness. People feel prepared for my return because they understand the theology of my return, not realizing that understanding an event is completely different from being ready for that event. The second manifestation of this barrier, Jesus continued, is substituting doctrinal correctness for heart reality. People become more concerned with defending their theological position than with examining their spiritual condition. The vision expanded to show me how this substitution manifested across different segments of Christianity. Some believers had become so invested in defending their particular view of the rapture, whether pre-tribulation, mid-tribulation, or post-tribulation, that they had lost sight of the more fundamental question of whether they were spiritually ready for any of those scenarios. Others had become so focused on proving their theological system was correct that they had stopped asking whether their theology was actually transforming their lives. They could win debates about end times doctrine while losing the spiritual reality that doctrine was meant to produce. This substitution of correctness for reality, Jesus explained, turns theology into an intellectual exercise rather than a transformational encounter. People become satisfied with having the right beliefs instead of being changed by those beliefs. The third manifestation of this barrier, Jesus said, is substituting emotional agreement for spiritual transformation. People feel moved by end times teaching while remaining unchanged by it. I watched as believers attended prophecy conferences and felt genuine excitement about Christ's return, experienced real emotion during worship about the rapture, and even shed tears while contemplating reunion with Jesus. But despite these sincere emotional responses, their actual character, priorities, and daily choices remained largely unchanged. This substitution of emotion for transformation, Jesus explained, is perhaps the most deceptive aspect of the final barrier because emotional response feels like spiritual reality. People mistake being moved by truth for being changed by truth, not realizing that feelings about transformation are not the same as actual transformation. The vision shifted to show me how this emotional substitution operated in different contexts. Some believers experience genuine spiritual highs during end times teaching, but return to their normal patterns of selfishness, materialism, and spiritual complacency once the emotional impact faded. Others felt sincere conviction about their need to be ready for Christ's return, but never translated that conviction into the kind of radical life changes that would actually prepare them for that event. The fourth manifestation of this barrier, Jesus continued, is substituting religious activity for spiritual reality. People engage in end times focused ministry while lacking the spiritual transformation that should motivate such ministry. I watched as believers threw themselves into prophecy teaching, end times evangelism, and rapture preparation activities while their own hearts remained largely unchanged by the realities they were proclaiming. Some became professional prophecy teachers who could deliver powerful messages about the need for readiness while lacking that readiness themselves. Others organized rapture preparation groups and end-time study sessions while using those activities as substitutes for the personal transformation that would actually make them ready for Christ's return. They were busy doing things related to the rapture while remaining spiritually unprepared for the rapture. This substitution of activity for reality, Jesus explained, allows people to feel like they're preparing for my return while avoiding the difficult work of actually being prepared. They mistake motion for progress, confusing busyness about end times with readiness for end times. The fifth and most dangerous manifestation of this barrier, Jesus said, his voice growing more solemn, is substituting presumptuous confidence for genuine assurance. People become certain they're ready for the rapture based on their theological knowledge rather than on their spiritual condition. The vision expanded to show me how this presumptuous confidence operated in the lives of believers who had mastered end times theology. They felt absolutely certain they would be included in the rapture because they believed in the rapture, had studied the rapture, and could defend their position about the rapture. But their confidence was based on intellectual agreement rather than spiritual reality. This presumptuous confidence, Jesus explained, is the most dangerous aspect of the final barrier because it prevents people from examining their actual spiritual condition. They're so certain they're ready, based on what they believe, that they never ask whether those beliefs have actually transformed them into people who could stand in my presence. As the vision continued, I could see how this presumptuous confidence manifested across different types of believers. Some were confident because they had been taught that the rapture was unconditional for all believers, so they never considered whether there might be conditions they hadn't met. Others were confident because they had extensive prophetic knowledge, assuming that understanding the rapture was the same as being ready for it. Still others were confident because they had made a profession of faith and been taught that was sufficient, never considering whether that profession had resulted in the kind of transformation that would make them ready for perfect union with Christ. The tragedy, Jesus said, is that this presumptuous confidence often increases in direct proportion to theological knowledge. The more people study about the rapture, the more confident they become that they're ready for it, even when that study hasn't produced any actual spiritual transformation. As the vision began to shift, I felt overwhelmed by the implications of what Jesus was revealing. The final barrier wasn't about lack of information, it was about the substitution of information for transformation. Millions of believers had learned to be satisfied with correct beliefs instead of being changed by those beliefs. But Lord, I asked, my voice breaking with the weight of recognition, how can someone know if they've fallen into this trap? How can believers distinguish between intellectual agreement and spiritual reality in their own lives? That's what I'll show you tomorrow night. Jesus replied, his expression mixing divine authority with infinite compassion. Meet me at the place where you first understood what it meant to be transformed by truth rather than just informed by it. There I will reveal the test that distinguishes between intellectual agreement and spiritual reality and show you how to remove this final barrier before it's too late. As his presence began to fade, his final words burned themselves into my consciousness. Tell them that the final barrier is not ignorance, but the substitution of intellectual agreement for spiritual reality. Tell them that believing in the rapture is not the same as being ready for the rapture. Tell them that theological knowledge without spiritual transformation is the most dangerous delusion in modern Christianity. And tell them that removing this barrier requires moving beyond what they know to being changed by what they know. And then I was alone in the Sedona prayer garden. The silence broken only by the distant sound of wind through the red rocks and the settling of the desert evening. But the weight of what Jesus had revealed pressed down on me like a crushing burden. The final barrier keeping millions from readiness for the rapture wasn't theological ignorance, it was theological satisfaction without transformation. Believers had learned to substitute prophetic knowledge for spiritual preparation, doctrinal correctness for heart reality, emotional agreement for actual change, religious activity for spiritual transformation, and presumptuous confidence for genuine assurance. The question that would torment me until our final meeting was whether I had fallen into this same trap and what it would take to move beyond intellectual agreement to the kind of spiritual reality that would make me truly ready for Christ's return. The third night was the most crucial of my life. Jesus' revelation about the final barrier, the substitution of intellectual agreement for spiritual reality, had exposed the tragic delusion affecting millions of believers who were confident about their readiness for the rapture while remaining spiritually unprepared for that encounter. But more personally, it had forced me to confront the terrifying possibility that I had fallen into this same trap. As instructed, I drove to a remote chapel in the mountains above Los Angeles, where I had once experienced a profound transformation years earlier. It was there, during a weekend retreat, that I had first understood the difference between knowing about God and actually knowing God, between having correct theology and being changed by that theology. The chapel was a simple stone structure nestled among pine trees, with rough wooden pews facing a stark altar beneath a massive wooden cross. I had knelt at that altar years before, not seeking more knowledge about God, but desperately crying out for genuine encounter with God. It was there that intellectual faith had given way to spiritual reality. As I settled into the same pew where that transformation had begun, I felt the familiar deepening of reality that preceded Jesus' appearances. The chapel seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the mountain moonlight filtering through stained glass windows. And then Jesus was kneeling at the altar, his presence both utterly natural and completely overwhelming. "This is where you first move beyond believing about me to actually knowing me," he said, his voice echoing softly in the sacred space. "Tonight, I'm going to show you how to remove the final barrier that's keeping millions from true readiness for my return, and give you the test that distinguishes between intellectual agreement and spiritual reality." Before I could respond, the chapel around us dissolved. We were observing what appeared to be the most intimate view yet of the human heart's relationship to divine truth, not just how people processed information about God, but how that information either transformed them or left them unchanged. Removing the final barrier, Jesus explained, requires understanding that spiritual truth is not meant to be possessed, but to possess you. It's not meant to be mastered, but to master you. The breakthrough comes when you stop trying to understand truth and start allowing truth to transform you. What I witnessed next was both simple and revolutionary. Jesus showed me the fundamental difference between approaching spiritual truth as information to be acquired versus reality to be experienced, between seeking to master theology versus allowing theology to master you. The first step in removing the barrier, Jesus said, is recognizing the difference between head knowledge and heart reality. Head knowledge can be acquired through study, but heart reality can only be received through surrender. I watched as this distinction played out in the lives of different believers. Some approached scripture study, prophecy conferences, and theological education as opportunities to acquire more information about God. They measured their spiritual progress by how much they knew rather than by how much they had been changed. Others approached the same spiritual resources as opportunities for encounter with God Himself. They didn't just study Scripture, they allowed Scripture to examine them. They didn't just attend prophecy conferences, they allowed prophetic truth to transform their priorities and perspectives. This recognition, Jesus explained, is crucial because it determines whether spiritual truth becomes a tool for intellectual pride or an instrument of spiritual transformation. Those who approach truth as information to be mastered remain trapped behind the final barrier. Those who approach truth as reality to be experienced find that barrier dissolving. The second step, Jesus continued, is moving from theological certainty to spiritual hunger. Instead of being satisfied with correct beliefs, you must become desperate for those beliefs to become reality in your life. The vision expanded to show me how this shift from certainty to hunger manifested in different believers. Some had become so confident in their theological knowledge that they had lost all sense of spiritual desperation. They felt they had arrived at truth rather than recognizing that truth needed to arrive in them. Others had maintained a holy dissatisfaction with the gap between what they knew intellectually and what they experienced spiritually. This dissatisfaction wasn't doubt about their beliefs, it was hunger for those beliefs to become transformational reality rather than just intellectual concepts. This spiritual hunger, Jesus explained, is essential because it creates the desperation necessary for breakthrough. Those who are satisfied with intellectual agreement will never seek the spiritual reality that lies beyond it. Only those who are hungry for more than knowledge will discover the transformation that knowledge is meant to produce. The third step, Jesus said, is submitting your understanding to transformation rather than trying to understand your way to transformation. You must stop trying to figure out how to be ready for the rapture and start allowing me to make you ready. I watched as believers who had been trapped behind the final barrier experienced this crucial shift. Instead of trying to understand their way to spiritual readiness, they began surrendering their need to understand and simply asked Jesus to do whatever was necessary to prepare them for his return. This submission of understanding, Jesus explained, is perhaps the most difficult step because it requires intellectual humility. People want to understand the process of transformation before they're willing to undergo it. But transformation happens through surrender, not through understanding. The vision shifted to show me how this submission operated practically. Some believers stopped trying to figure out exactly what bridal readiness looked like and simply asked Jesus to make them ready, whatever that required. Others ceased their attempts to understand the mechanics of spiritual transformation and simply opened themselves to whatever work Christ wanted to do in their hearts. The fourth step, Jesus continued, is allowing truth to examine you rather than using truth to examine others. Instead of applying prophetic knowledge to judge other people's readiness, you must allow that same knowledge to reveal your own spiritual condition. I watched as this shift transformed how believers approached end times teaching. Instead of using prophecy to speculate about who would or wouldn't be ready for the rapture, they began using prophetic truth as a mirror to examine their own hearts. Instead of feeling superior to other believers who seemed less prepared, they became increasingly aware of their own need for transformation. This self-examination, Jesus explained, is crucial because the final barrier often manifests as spiritual pride disguised as theological knowledge. People use their understanding of end times to judge others while remaining blind to their own spiritual condition. True breakthrough comes when knowledge humbles you rather than elevating you. The fifth and final step, Jesus said, is the test that reveals whether you've moved beyond intellectual agreement to spiritual reality. As he spoke these words, the atmosphere in the vision became intensely focused, and I could sense that we were approaching the most crucial revelation of all. The test, Jesus said, is this: does your knowledge of end times truth produce ongoing transformation in your daily life, or does it produce satisfaction with your current spiritual condition? Does believing in the rapture make you more desperate to be ready for it, or does it make you confident that you're already ready? I watched as this test was applied to different believers, revealing the true nature of their relationship to prophetic truth. Some who had extensive knowledge about the rapture showed no evidence of the spiritual urgency, character development, or life transformation that such knowledge should produce. Their beliefs had become intellectual possessions rather than transformational realities. Others with the same theological knowledge showed clear evidence of ongoing transformation. Their understanding of Christ's return had created holy desperation for readiness, radical changes in priorities, and increasing conformity to Christ's character. Their beliefs were actively changing them rather than simply informing them. This test, Jesus explained, reveals whether someone has moved beyond the final barrier or is still trapped behind it. Those who have broken through show evidence of ongoing transformation. Those who remain trapped show evidence of spiritual satisfaction despite their extensive knowledge. As the vision began to fade and the mountain chapel gradually reappeared around us, Jesus rose from the altar and came to sit beside me in the pew, his eyes filled with both infinite love and penetrating truth. "Jonathan," he said, "I've shown you these things not to create despair but to provide hope. The final barrier is real, and millions of believers are trapped behind it. But breakthrough is possible for anyone willing to move beyond intellectual agreement to spiritual reality. The steps I've shown you," he continued, "are not a formula to be followed but a process to be experienced. You cannot remove the final barrier through human effort or spiritual technique. You can only remove it by surrendering your need to understand and allowing me to transform you through the truth you already possess." As his presence began to intensify rather than fade, I realized this wasn't just information he was sharing, it was an invitation he was extending. "Right now," Jesus said, "you can choose to move beyond intellectual agreement about the rapture to spiritual reality about the rapture. You can stop being satisfied with correct beliefs and become desperate for those beliefs to transform you. You can submit your understanding to my transforming work and allow me to make you truly ready for my return." The invitation hung in the chapel air like a living thing. Everything in me wanted to analyze it, understand it better, or approach it gradually. But I could see that those very impulses were expressions of the final barrier, the attempt to understand my way to transformation rather than surrendering to transformation. I don't want to just believe in the rapture anymore, I whispered. I want to be ready for it. Then stop trying to understand readiness and start asking me to create it in you, Jesus replied with infinite gentleness. Stop being satisfied with theological knowledge and become desperate for spiritual reality. The breakthrough you need is not more information, it's transformation by the information you already have. In that moment, kneeling at the same altar where I had first encountered God's transforming presence years before, I made a choice that changed everything. I stopped trying to understand my way to readiness for the rapture and simply surrendered to whatever work Christ needed to do to make me ready. What happened next was both devastating and liberating. Jesus began revealing areas where I had substituted intellectual agreement for spiritual reality, where I had been satisfied with correct beliefs instead of being transformed by those beliefs. But as he exposed these areas, he also began the work of transformation that would remove the final barrier. It wasn't about acquiring new knowledge or understanding new concepts. It was about allowing the truth I already possessed to possess me completely. It was about moving from knowing about the rapture to being prepared for the rapture through ongoing transformation. As his presence finally began to fade, his final words burned themselves into my consciousness. Tell them that the final barrier is not ignorance but satisfaction with intellectual agreement instead of spiritual reality. Tell them that believing in the rapture is not the same as being ready for the rapture. Tell them that breakthrough comes not through understanding more but through being transformed by what they already know. And tell them that I am ready to remove this barrier from anyone willing to move beyond theological knowledge to spiritual reality. For weeks now, this truth has revolutionized my understanding of what it means to be ready for Christ's return. The final barrier keeping millions from true readiness isn't lack of information, it's satisfaction with information instead of transformation by that information. The breakthrough comes when you stop trying to understand your way to readiness and start surrendering to the transforming work of Christ. It comes when you move beyond intellectual agreement about the rapture to spiritual reality about the rapture. It comes when your knowledge of end times produces ongoing transformation rather than satisfaction with your current condition. The test is simple. Does your belief in the rapture make you more desperate to be ready for it, or does it make you confident that you're already ready? Your answer may determine whether you experience the rapture or whether you need the tribulation to complete the transformation that should have happened through surrender to the truth you already possess. The choice is yours, and the breakthrough is available now for anyone willing to move beyond the final barrier to the spiritual reality that lies beyond it.